Agencies were complaining that thousands of civilians still remain trapped inside and urged that humanitarian corridors be created in order to enable evacuations. In a moment, we'll bring you a report from our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who is in Aleppo. But first, let's hear what Mr. Lavrov had to say.
I can inform you that the Syrian army suspended active military operations in eastern Aleppo today because another withdrawal, and so far the largest evacuation of civilians, is being carried out. It's a column of about 8,000 people, a colossal operation, and its route is 5 kilometres long.
Well, for more, let's get this report from the BBC's Richard Galpin.
Pro-government forces in eastern Aleppo apparently pressing home their advantage in this video provided by the Syrian military. 3 weeks into their offensive, they've recaptured 3/4 of the rebel stronghold in the city. Their most recent gains made much easier by the rebels retreating from their front lines around the old city. The government is already claiming victory.
The victory in Aleppo is strategic and will change the way a political settlement is achieved. Now the international community must discuss what it can provide for the Syrian people and send humanitarian aid through the government.
The humanitarian crisis is growing by the day. Tens of thousands of people fleeing to other parts of the city in search of food, shelter and medicine after the long government-imposed siege of eastern Aleppo. And although the Red Cross and Red Crescent have finally managed to get some of the sick, injured and disabled out of the conflict zone, many others remain trapped. The situation is now so desperate inside the last rebel-held areas that even the White Helmet rescue teams, who've saved thousands of lives, have now appealed to the international community for safe passage out of the area. In a statement, they say if they're not evacuated, their volunteers face torture and execution in the Syrian regime's detention centres, and therefore they need urgent action to save the lives of humanitarians in the besieged part of the city. But just as pro-government forces backed by Russia and Iran prepared to finish off the rebels in Aleppo, Moscow has announced the offensive is being suspended. This apparently to allow some of the thousands of civilians trapped in the remaining rebel areas to leave. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, the United States will wait and see whether Russia follows through helping cease military operations in eastern Aleppo in an effort to remove civilians. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people have been fleeing the city without international aid and just on their own devices. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, has been to Tariq Al-Bab to find out more about this exodus of people from East Aleppo.
There are no formal humanitarian corridors. No one could agree on them. But there's this. Thousands of people are now fleeing every day, wherever they can, however they can. These people came through a hole that was smashed through the wall nearby that mosque, and as you can hear, the fighting is still going on. They've all come from Salhin, where there's been intense fighting for that area. The Syrian army and its allies have almost moved in, but these people have fled whenever they got a moment. They've lived with years of war, but everyone we speak to says they haven't lived through the fighting that they've had of the last few days. Children speak of being frightened, people living without enough food or water and absolutely no safety. Even the journey here was risky. One woman told me that they tried to escape a few days ago. They came under fire and her husband was killed. So she's here on her own with her 5 children. Everyone here has a terrible story to tell. Not knowing where they'll go now, not knowing when this war will end. They're dependent on handouts, dependent on a course of the war over lives for which they have absolutely no control.
Lise Doucet with that report. Britain's Foreign Intelligence Chief has warned that Islamic State militants are using the turmoil caused by Russian bombing in Syria to plot attacks on the UK and its allies. In a rare public speech, the MI6 chief, Alex Younger, said that Moscow and the Syrian government were trying to create a desert and call it peace. But this strategy made it harder to defeat extremists. He said Britain now faced an unprecedented terrorist threat, with 12 plots against it disrupted in the past 3 years and hundreds of investigations still underway. The UK government has distanced itself from comments made by its Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, in which he's accused Saudi Arabia of pursuing proxy wars in the Middle East. The Prime Minister's spokeswoman said that the Foreign Secretary's views did not reflect the government's position. Mr Johnson's comments were made at a conference in Rome last week.
You've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it.
Well, let's get more on the significance of Boris Johnson's comments and its possible impact on Saudi-UK relations. We can speak to Laura James, who's a Middle East analyst from the global analysis and advisory firm Oxford Analytica. Thanks very much for joining us. Wasn't the Foreign Secretary simply stating something that many people regard as true? And I just want to mention here, Hillary Clinton WikiLeaks emails with John Podesta from 2014, where she identifies apparently the Gulf states of Saudi and Qatar as clandestine financial and logistic supporters of terrorist groups.
I think that most people would at least agree that proxy wars are going on in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's fairly well known, but it isn't British government policy to say so. I think also some of the language Boris Johnson used, like puppeteering and abusing religion, Islam specifically, are not really the kind of words you expect from a foreign secretary.
But in this age of Trump and a lot of populist change, what you're saying effectively is that he is not allowed to say something that is widely accepted. Why not?
I think it'll be interesting to find out whether or not he's allowed to say it. He has obviously been slapped down by Number 10. They've distanced themselves from his comments. He's being sent off to Saudi Arabia more or less to apologise, it seems. But nothing else has particularly happened. So it may be that it turns out that Boris Johnson is allowed to go and say things that other people wouldn't in the world of diplomacy, and that will continue.
Doesn't this point, though, to a growing unease diplomatically, here in the West? We've seen, of course, the 9/11 families being given support to take legal action against the Saudi government. We've also seen a lot of worries around the Saudi involvement in Yemen, which Britain is also backing.
Yes, and indeed Boris Johnson is backing. So Boris Johnson has been one of the high-profile people defending the fact that Britain is selling arms to Saudi Arabia that are used to prosecute the war in Yemen. So it seems that his private views perhaps are somewhat different or less official, but his official line that he's sticking to is that Britain is an ally of Saudi Arabia and that the war is legitimate, not a proxy war.
Again, though, people are going to say, what is the difference and why are we now in this hypocritical position where the British government, hasn't done any investigation into human rights abuses in Yemen? That's what the critics say, and yet we're still supplying lots of arms and weapons and even training on targeting, apparently, where civilians are being killed, to a regime that many people are very, very critical of. Isn't it time for some straight talking rather than indulging in these old alliances?
I'm not going to sit here and defend British policy towards Saudi Arabia. I think that the question is, what's the alternative policy? Now, Theresa May has just been to Bahrain to attend the Gulf Summit. It was a very high-profile event. She was the first female leader to go. And this is because I think that in a post-Brexit world, alliances like that with the Gulf are very important. The government wants to show that it can still trade abroad, that it still has special relationships, even given the uncertainties over Trump. So while I absolutely take and agree with a lot of the ethical points that you're making, I think it's comprehensible why the British government has chosen this policy. Very interesting. More to come on this, I think. Laura James, many thanks for your time.
Now, tsunami warnings have been issued for the Solomon Islands and South Pacific region after a powerful 7.7 magnitude quake. The Pacific Warning Centre says widespread hazardous tsunami waves remain a risk for several hours after an earthquake which hit off the coast of the Solomon Islands. Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Nauru and New Caledonia are also facing this warning. The German car maker Volkswagen has already been heavily fined in the United States over its use of defeat devices used to hide true levels of emissions. Well, now 7 countries accused of failing to act against VW are themselves the subject of legal action by the European Commission. The UK, Germany, Spain and Luxembourg face criticism for doing nothing in the wake of the emissions scandal, whilst the EU says the Czech Republic, Lithuania and Greece do not even have a mechanism for imposing any penalties. The BBC's Damien Grammaticus is in Brussels.
Now, there are several things that it's identified. The first thing is a group of countries which it says do not even have any system of penalties in place to deter car companies from trying to cheat in vehicle testing. Now, that includes Greece, the Czech Republic and Lithuania. It says the Commission says that they have to bring in those penalties. But also, importantly, it's identified other countries who it says have failed to impose the penalties they could already do on Volkswagen. And there we have Germany, the United Kingdom, and Spain as 3 of those. Now, what the Commission is saying is that these countries, where what happens is that the national authorities do the testing, Europe sets the emissions limits, but the cars are tested nationally before they can be sold across Europe. They're certified as okay, not polluting. What it's saying is that what Volkswagen did, it was installed this cheat software that enabled the cars when they were being tested to lower their emissions, pass the test, and then on the roads they would pollute. It's saying that the UK and others should be imposing penalties, but also must hand over the information they've gathered in their investigations into Volkswagen to the Commission, so the Commission can check and see what that data shows, because there is one sort of get-out clause for Volkswagen here, which is that it is allowed under UK and EU law and American law to have such defeat devices, cheat devices in its cars, if they're designed to protect the engines from severe harm. And it could be that that's the argument being made. But the countries have 2 months to respond, and the EU is saying it wants to see this because it wants to act to preserve European environmental standards, health standards.
Damien Grammaticus there for us. She's best known for her role in the TV show Modern Family, but now Sofia Vergara is making headlines as she faces a lawsuit from her own embryos. You heard right, the US actress is being sued by 2 frozen embryos that she conceived with her former partner, Nick Loeb, whom she split from 2 years ago. Well, with me to explain all that is Lisa Bloom, a legal analyst joining us from Los Angeles. Lisa, can you just explain how this is happening and what is happening?
Well, several years ago, Sofia Vergara and her now ex implanted several embryos, and they were then frozen. And there are now 2 left. They have since broken up. Sofia has married someone else. And her ex, Nick Loeb, now wants custody of those embryos. He wants to have them implanted in a surrogate and, become babies and become children. And she's opposed to it. They signed a contract at the time that said they would only become implanted and be brought to life if both parties agreed. But nevertheless, Nick Loeb appears now to have connected with some pro-life forces in Louisiana, probably our most pro-life state, and brought this case on behalf of the embryos who he has named Emma and Isabella. So Emma and Isabella are the plaintiffs, the one bringing the case under a Louisiana law, which is unique in the United States, that allows embryos to sue.
And apparently he's quoted as saying you can't keep 4 frozen lives forever or kill them. We will go to hell. What is the likelihood of him winning this case, and what will that mean?
Well, this is an extremely unusual case. I've been practicing law for 30 years and doing family law, and I've never seen a case like this. And even under the Louisiana law, everyone is saying that this is the first case of its kind. Louisiana would have to have jurisdiction over both parties. Neither of them live there, but he has set up a trust, and the trustee is also a plaintiff. So they've done some very creative legal moves. It's going to depend on a judge. I would say this case should be thrown out immediately, but given that Louisiana law is unique in this area, it could very well go forward.
Lisa Bloom, thank you very much. Now, Paris is suffering some of its worst air pollution for a decade. So, for part of this week, motorists can only use their cars on alternate days, as Katrina Renton reports.
One of the most famous skylines in the world vanishes in a haze. Hiding beneath the grey smog, the Eiffel Tower. The reason? The lovely weather Paris has been having lately. Bright sunshine, no rain, and very little wind. Trapping pollution, like vehicle emissions. So, city bosses have come up with a solution to half the amount of traffic on the road. Over a few days this week, you can only take your car out on alternate days. So on one day, if your car has an odd number plate, you're banned from the road. The next, it's even numbers. Flout it, and you face a fine of €22. In return, all public transport is free. The verdict?
I think it should help with the pollution. Plus, it's really pleasant to have Paris with half the number of cars it usually has.
I think it's a good thing, but it's a bit of a pain at the same time, as today it's free. People are no longer using their cars, but the trains are full. We no longer have any space. It's a real pain.
It annoys me because I need my car for work. I'm a salesman. I have employees to pay at the end of the month, and now I'm blocked.
This is only the fourth time in 20 years Paris has imposed such a ban. There are exceptions if you have 3 or more people in the car, electric vehicles, and buses and taxis. Since July, cars that are 20 years old and over have not been allowed on the road in Paris. The Air Pollution Agency has said that the current problem is a result not of higher emissions, but that they're not being dispersed effectively. Katrina Renton, BBC News.
Israel's parliament is taking steps to protect thousands of Jewish homes built on private Palestinian land. It's been met with anger from Palestinians and international criticism. Until now, Israel has treated outposts built by hardline settlers without government approval as unlawful. Efforts to change the law come just ahead of a deadline for the demolition of the biggest Jewish outpost in the West Bank, Amona. Here's our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell.
The wedding of 18-year-old Shaked is bittersweet for her family and guests. Many are from Amona, where she's lived since she was a baby and wants to stay. There are 40 households of religious settlers here. They say God promised this land to the Jews. But the Israeli High Court says the outpost was built without permits on private Palestinian land and must be demolished. Shaked's father, Elad Zev, is outraged.
The lives of 200 kids is going to be destroyed. They're going to be kicked out of their homes. They're going to be in the street because someone said that the land is his. He never proved it. The Supreme Court never asked them to prove it.
But on the edge of a Palestinian village not far from Amona, I get a very different perspective. Ibrahim Yaqub tells me that for generations, his family grew crops on their plot of land on the hilltop. It's been a long legal battle to try to get it back.
The High Court said that this land is for the Palestinian people and you must evacuate this land in this time. But the government tried to delete everything and didn't respect this decision.
And now a majority of Israeli MPs are backing steps to make outposts legal under Israeli law. These might not save Amona, but they would protect about 4,000 Jewish homes in the occupied West Bank.
Decisions being made here at the Israeli parliament are about much more than the residents of Amona and other outposts. They're reshaping government policy on settlements. And that could have huge implications for the chances of any future peace deal with the Palestinians.
Back in 2006, Clashes between Israeli settlers and security forces when 9 houses in Amona were knocked down after a High Court ruling. Now, whatever alternative they're offered, the settlers here say they won't leave peacefully. Meanwhile, Palestinians are worried that if Israel passes its planned legislation, other settlements like this one will stay and more could follow. And they say that could end their hopes of a future independent state. Yolande Knell in Amona in the West Bank.
Now, the need to protect elephants, mostly from poaching, is well known. Well, now there's also concern about giraffes, whose numbers have declined so dramatically that they've been classified as vulnerable to extinction. The causes: loss of natural habitat and civil unrest in many parts of Africa, as well as poaching. Our science correspondent Victoria Gill reports.
Highly recognisable. But while Chester Zoo's giraffes are loved by visitors, in their natural African habitat, these animals are suffering what's being called a devastating decline.
Here at the zoo, it's easy to get close to the giraffes, especially when you're up on a high feeding platform. They're very used to people. But in the wild, they're naturally curious, and that leaves them vulnerable to poaching.
That illegal hunting, along with expanding agriculture and civil unrest, have all been cited as factors pushing this long-necked mammal towards extinction. A regularly updated global assessment of the world's plant and animal species has today upgraded their conservation status to vulnerable.
Now recognising them as being a threat of extinction on the red list heightens our awareness of the issues they're facing, and in some ways it makes it easier for us to try and tackle those. It gives us an added impetus to try and work with them. So being on the red list, whilst it's bad news in itself, of course, it's showing that they've undergone a massive decline. It's great in that we're focusing on that before the decline is too late.
The list has also shown an increasing threat to many bird species. The African grey parrot, a prized mimic, is now listed as endangered, and that's due in part to unsustainable levels of trapping. In some parts of the continent, numbers of these famously talkative birds have declined by as much as 99%. But while the numbers can make grim reading, conservationists hope the list will spark international action, and that in the midst of an emerging extinction crisis, people can still make space for the tallest mammal on Earth. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
Well, Dr. Julian Fennessy from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature joins us now from Windhoek, the capital of Namibia. We see your lovely wooden giraffes, I think, just peeking out behind you. How worried are you about the numbers?
I mean, obviously, it's very sad to hear this decline. I mean, 40% in the last 30 years is devastating. That's indeed. But there is also some positive news in the sense that giraffe in southern Africa have increased, at least doubled, if not tripled, in Namibia and South Africa. So we now have more than 50% of the giraffe in southern Africa. But what we need to do is we need to make a real difference and a real change throughout East and Central Africa.
And I'm just reading that, in some parts where there is war and civil strife, northern Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, the giraffes are war fodder. People are eating them.
No, sadly, that's one of the things that's happening is, there's militia groups that have been operating for the last decades in these areas. And what do they feed on? They can't go to a shop or anything like that. So giraffe, war fodder, they're on the hoof and they're very large animals. So they can feed a lot of people. So while this is an impact, it's not really the biggest impact. Human population growth in general has had the biggest impact on habitat loss and fragmentation, which has resulted in giraffe numbers and other wildlife being depleted.
So what should be done and what can be done?
Well, I think there is a positive and a negative to this. We now know what the situation is. But what we can do from here is that we can encourage and work closely with governments across Africa to develop national strategies and action plans. And from that, we can get down to the devil in the detail. What do we need to do? Do we need to do anti-poaching patrol, as an example, in certain parks or areas? So from that, hopefully we can commit and get the international community and support behind to be able to provide funds and technical effort to make this difference before it's too late.
Absolutely. They are thrilled to see in the wild, as I once saw very luckily on safari. Thank you so much and good luck with your work. Thank you. So Mick Jagger has announced that he has become a father for the 8th time at the age of 73. A spokesman for the Rolling Stones frontman said his partner, the American ballerina Melanie Hamrick, who is 29 years old, had given birth to a son in New York. Mick Jagger has 7 other children and became a great-grandfather 2 years ago. Greg Lake, the lead singer with the influential supergroup Emerson, Lake and Palmer, has died of cancer at the age of 69.
They said there'll be snow at Christmas. They said there'll be peace on earth.
He found success initially with the band King Crimson before joining Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer in London in 1970, creating hit albums for many years. That's it from me, Geetha Gurumurthy. This is BBC News. Thanks for watching us.